Hello and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Bryant and I'll be your host for this webinar. Please make sure your microphones and web cameras are disabled during the presentation to provide for a smooth recording. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You're welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments and insights. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is next week on Wednesday, October 7th, Going Further with Scottish Genealogy, and that'll be with Hannah Bell. If you'd like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Rachel Derenthal, who will be giving a presentation on Hopping the Pond, First Steps to Finding Your English Ancestors. Rachel Derenthal graduated in 2011 from Brigham Young University with a degree in Middle East Studies and Arabic. Over the next few years, her interest in genealogy grew, and she enrolled in the associate degree at Brigham Young University, Idaho, for family history research. Since then, she has gained experience working with Ancestry progenealogists as an associate researcher specializing in the southern United States, Trace.com as a contract genealogist, started her own genealogy company, and now works as a project manager for legacy tree genealogists. And we're glad to have Rachel here with us today. And Rachel, if you're ready, we'll turn the time over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me go ahead and see if I can get this screen shared. Okay, can everybody see that all right? Bryant, does that look good?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I'm excited to talk to you about just your first steps to finding your British ancestors, because this is the area where I kind of cut my teeth on when I started family history research, because a lot of my family is from England and fairly recently, like great-grandparents immigrating. And so this is something that when I started, this is before I started my degree, my associate's degree in family history research. And so I found myself having such a hard time knowing figuring out the methodology and knowing what my first step should be. And so I'm hoping that this webinar will give you that. We'll give you the first steps and give you some tips and tricks that will make the transition from the United States to England a little bit more easy for you. And I should note that what we're going to focus on here is going to be post 1837. So ancestors that you're searching for post 1837. If you are looking for before then, the methodology and the record groups are going to be different that you'll start with. And so basically, if you're looking for your colonial ancestors and going back to England from there, this webinar is probably not going to help you very much. But if you're looking around 1837 and late for you. Okay, so the first thing that we should talk about is just what information do you need if you're going to make the jump back to England? So the name of your ancestor, and sometimes they change their name. So this might seem like a basic thing, but it can actually be more difficult than it sounds. So if you can, to the best of your knowledge, the name of your ancestor, the approximate year that they were born. It doesn't need to be exact. Some range though, within 5 years would be helpful. If you know the county or parish general area where they lived in England, that's helpful. And now would probably be a good time to talk a little bit about how jurisdictions work in England. And when I say jurisdictions, I'm talking about the entities that would have created records for your ancestors. And so just to simplify everything, you have a county similar to our counties, and then there are multiple parishes within a county. And so that will give you an idea when we jump to census records what we're looking at. And then if you know the name of the ancestor's parents, that's also really helpful. However, sometimes you don't know that information. So if you know maybe names of siblings, aunts, uncles, sometimes you know the grandparents because they live with the grandparents instead. All of that information can help you tie the family together and learn more about your ancestor in England. And I'm going to show you some examples of all of this as we go through my own family that we're going to track. So the two record groups tonight that we're really going to focus on are census and then civil registration. And when I say civil registration, I'm referring to the birth, marriages, and deaths that started to be required to be registered in 1837. And that's something to keep in mind. It's a little bit different from the United States, where you would probably go, like for me, I would go to the New Jersey Health Department to order birth, marriage, or death. Well, in England, you do that on a country level. You go to the General Register Office to order. And I'm going to go through that as well today. So if you're familiar with United States research, the Census of England, it has some unique attributes that we should talk about because they will influence how you research and the way that you think about what you're looking at. So the first thing to note is everyone is enumerated on the same day. So they call this census night. And so let's say, for example, you're the head of the household and you have two children that are staying with grandma that night. Well, when you fill out the enumeration form, you're not going to include the two children because they're not spending the night on census night at your house. So that's something to keep in mind, because if you saw something like that in the United States, you might think, oh, well, I was expecting to see these children here because they were on the previous census 10 years before. Oh, maybe they passed away or something like that, right? In England, that is still possible, of course, but you do want to keep in mind that maybe they were just staying somewhere else because of how strictly the enumeration was on do it on census night and only the people who were spending the night at the house. Okay, and so these are the specific dates over here on the slide when each census was taken. Okay, so there isn't any major record loss until 1931. 1931 census was destroyed in World War II, and then the 1941 census was not taken because of the war. And so the 1939 register is a unique record that was created at the onset of World War II. And it kind of acts as a census. It's really an invaluable resource because it kind of spans that big 20-year gap where we don't have a census. And so we'll also be going over that today. Okay, so this next part, just, strap in. It's going to be a little tedious, but I think it's important. And I'm playing with the idea of turning this PowerPoint into a PDF if people are interested, that we can share with you so you have this information. So I'm just going to go over what you could expect to see on each census. And we'll try to go through this part quickly so we get to the good part. Okay, so 1841 is the first census where we get every person in the household's name. And we get their age. And then it tells us, okay, the county where the household is being enumerated. Were you born in that county or were you not born in that county? And they'll just mark it with a Y or an N. And then this is really important to remember when we jump over to 1851, because if it's over 15 years old, if the individual's over 15 years old, the age is rounded down to the nearest 5. And so sometimes I remember when I first started, I would get caught up on this until I learned about that. When I would go to 1851, I'd be like, oh, I don't know if this is them because the years are so off, the birth year. So remember that when you're jumping from 1841 to 1851. Okay, whether the house was inhabited or building or inhabited or uninhabited, it's not probably vital to your research, but it is there. In 1851, the ages are no longer rounded. You have a specific place of birth. So now they're going to name the parish and the county. Sometimes you just get the county. But you get more specifics about where they were born. Relationship to the head of the household is provided, the condition or marital status of the individual, and then the removal of the question about the house being inhabited. 1861 to 1891, pretty much the same as 1851. You've got some minimal changes about the houses being inhabited, and then the number of rooms occupied in the structure. 1901, you get some more significant changes. You've got the age at the last birthday, and then whether an employer, the individual is the employer, a worker, or self-employed essentially. And so that's nice detail because you can kind of gauge where your ancestor is. Are they a little wealthier? Are they the employer, or are they self-employed or the worker? And then whether they work at home and the language spoken. Now 1911 it's a really neat record. So the way that they do the 1911 census is the household, a single page of the census is one single household. So you're not getting multiple households on the page. And then it also asks the completed years of the marriage, the number of children born alive and still living, and the number that have passed away. And this is significant because let's say you've tracked one of your female ancestors and you say, okay, I've tracked them in the multiple censuses, they had 10 kids, but in 1911 she's still alive. And she says, oh, I had 15 children, only 10 are still living. And that could be a red flag to you. Oh no, I might need to go check out church records or civil registration to see if I can find other children that might have died in between censuses. Then we get the industry that they worked in, nationality, and then what's really special is if your ancestor is the person filling out the enumeration form, which is typically the head of the household, you're going to get their signature, which is nice. And then the full postal address. Whew, okay, we're done with the little bit more tedious details, but they're important to remember. And so if you wanted to screenshot those, if you did, no problem. And we'll probably share that PDF later. Okay, so we're in 1841. We're looking at my ancestors. They are the Sharman family. They are in Gloucester. And if you see here, this is what you're going to expect to see, right? This is Thomas Sharman is 35. And if you know, a lot of the ages are, rounded. If they're over 15, you see that it's 25, 25, 30, 35, right? And so you can see the rounding there. We get occupation. He was a stocking, and it says W. He's a stocking framework knitter, and you'll see that in various censuses. And then you've got, if you look over on the right where it says where born, you can see yes, 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 yes for his family, except for Thomas himself. He was not born in Gloucester. Okay, and then you've just got his wife, and I know it's his wife because we will confirm that in later census records and civil registration. It doesn't tell you here though, so keep that in mind. Catherine, his daughter, William, James, John, Thomas, and Richard. And you want to note these names because you want to see if these children are carrying over to the next census so you can confirm it's your ancestor. Okay, so 1851, we have Thomas Sharman. He's still in Gloucester, St. Margaret's Parish, framework knitter. He's 44, and that's close enough to the age. That makes sense based on the rounding. And what's also matching here, you'll see, is where are they born? Well, everyone else in the family is born in Gloucestershire, but he's born in Bristol. Well, that matches what we knew previously as well. And then what's really interesting, and I didn't highlight it in a box, but if you'll note here, there's a William Sharman, and he's about the same age as Thomas Sharman. And that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at census records. Think, especially, let's say I went back on Thomas Sharman, I was researching it, and I couldn't find his parents. Well, if I had noted William Sharman, who's as likely his brother or a cousin, another relative, then I could research him and see if he provides any of the details that I'm looking for. So just kind of stay aware of who's on the page with your ancestor and who's on the page before and on the page after. And now from here, what we're going to do is we're going to actually track Thomas Sharman's son, who's 6 years old, Lebbeus, because of his name, he's a really good person to demonstrate because his name is constantly written incorrectly or indexed incorrectly. And so it's great to show you some tips on what to do if you come across an ancestor like that. So let's follow Lebbeus into 1861. Okay, so William Sharman was a son of Thomas Sharman. Lebbeus is staying with his brother. He's 16. He's born in Gloucester, so that tracks, that matches everything that we know about him. And then William Sharman has 2 daughters living with him. Now, my direct ancestor is actually William Sharman's 3rd daughter, who should be here. She's about 6, but she's not. And she's actually alive, and I, to be honest, to date, have not found her in the 1861 census. And I'm not sure where she is, but she's not staying with her father. And her father is widowed. Mother actually died during childbirth of my ancestor, Sarah Ann Sharman. But let's go on to the next census. If you look at Lebbeus, he's married now, and look who's living with him. Sarah Ann Sharman, his niece, born in Rothwell, Northampton, wool spinner. So you can see the Sharmans have carried on the tradition of working with wool, cloth, knitting, and they do that over the next few decades as well. You see Lebbeus Sharman, he's a bricklayer, born in Gloucester, St. Margaret. The age is tracking, and he's married to Selina. Okay, we're on to 1881. Now this is where things can get a little hairy with Lebbeus, okay? So the first thing is when this is indexed, it's indexed as Lillian's, and I had the hardest time finding him. What made me confident it was him was that his niece, Sarah Ann Sharman, married Charles Welch. Charles Welch's father is Frederick Welch and Elizabeth Welch. Okay, and so you can see if you get more familiar with the family, extended family, and you kind of keep those names in the back of your head, you can look for things and say, oh, this makes sense. This is my ancestor. I'm pulling everything together. He probably knew them. He probably helped raise Sarah. And so I'd imagine that for that reason, he felt comfortable moving in with Frederick and his wife. Now you'll note the thing that really held me up on this one is he's listed as unmarried. But in the previous census, he was married, and I thought, oh, well, maybe he's widowed, and that was just they enumerated that incorrectly. But I did some digging in Selina. She's actually alive and well and living with her mother at this time, listed as a Sharman and married. So again, sometimes we want to put on our present day ideas and what we think the 1880s were like, but just keep in mind, just human nature and things happen and they've happened for centuries, right? And so it looks to me, based off the records, that Lebbeus is actually separated from his wife. So keep that in mind when you see something. It could be an error in the enumeration, but it could be signaling to you that something else is happening in the family. Okay, 1891. You can see, okay, so you can see how Lebbeus's name is spelled there, Lehesius. And again, I had the hardest time finding him this way. And so some tips on what to do here. The first thing that I would do is find the name, whether it's the first or the last name, that's the least likely to be spelled incorrectly. And then go with the age range and the birthplace. His birthplace stays consistently Gloucester. And then when it's added, consistently St. Margaret. And so that's where I would start. I wouldn't start with his first name if I know or I'm seeing that it's being spelled incorrectly. And maybe I'll put an L and an asterisk to search. But the other thing that I did was when I had trouble finding him, I searched for Frederick Welch just to see if Lebbeus was living near him because it seemed like they might be close. And it turns out he's still living with them, working as a bricklayer. Okay, there's Lebbeus again, 1901. Now, Lebbeus is in the poor house, the Union Workhouse, St. Margaret in Gloucester. And he's a widower now, which is confirmed. Selina does pass away by this time. And he's listed as a pauper. He's a bricklayer, born in Gloucester, so that all tracks. And this one was easy to find. His name was spelled right, and it was indexed correctly, so that was a win for me. Now, 1911, I didn't find Lebbeus after that. I didn't find him in civil registration for deaths or in the 1911 census. I imagine he probably passed away before the 1911 census, and I also imagine because of how many variations there are of his name and the spelling, and I'm going to show you what I mean when we go to his marriage index record. I imagine that's part of the reason why I'm having trouble finding him. Okay, so 1911 Census of England, we're going back to Lebbeus's niece and William Sharman's daughter, Sarah Ann, who is now Welch. And you can see here, she's the head of the household. We've got all her children. She says she had 12 children that she gave birth to. Only 11 are living. You can see all their occupations, where they were born, whether they're the worker or the employer. And then you can see who signed, so who filled out the form. And it actually turns out it was Josiah, probably Josiah Welch, based off the J there. And it was unfortunate. I was hopeful that I would see my ancestor's signature here. And you might get to see your ancestor's signature there. That's typical for the head of household. But in this scenario, the eldest son filled it out for her. And then lastly, we're going to just talk a little bit about the 1939 England and Wales Register. So this register is available on most large genealogy research websites. It's free on FamilySearch. Then it's also available on Ancestry, Find My Past, My Heritage, etc. It was taken on the 29th of September, 1939 at the onset of the war. And it was made initially to just create national identity cards. But again, since the 1931 census was destroyed and the 1941 census was not performed, this is an invaluable resource if you've got ancestors that are living more recently in England. Now, the names of the living individuals are blacked out, and according to Ancestry's website, they will be annually adding records for those with birth dates older than 100 years, or if a record of death has been reported to the National Archives. So here's what it looks like, and I've just tracked one of the Sharman children here. And so you can see their names, and it gives specific birth date, which is very helpful, especially if you want to go and find them in civil registration. So this acts as kind of a census in its own right, and something to just be aware of if you have more recent ancestors. Okay, so that is census, and we're going to move on to civil registration. So civil registration began 1st of July, 1837 for births, marriage, and deaths in both England and Wales. Excuse me. And the births from 1837 to 1875, in some parts of England, non-compliance was estimated as great as 15%. And the specific areas that were listed is Surrey, Sussex, Shropshire, and Middlesex. Okay. Now the Act of 1874 comes around, and it created a fee for late and non-registration, which upped the number of compliant citizens for births. Now, thinking about the history of this prior to civil registration, if you wanted to have proof that you were legally the son of somebody or a daughter of somebody for inheritance, then you would have your child baptized in the local parish church, and that would count. And so I imagine, and from books that I've read, that is probably the thought process here up until the Act of 1874. Hey, you know, it's still legal if I just get them baptized, and I'm already going to baptize them, so why register, right? So just keep that in mind if you're looking for an ancestor before 1874 and you're not finding the birth in the civil registration, it's possible that they didn't register it. So if you've done everything you can, kind of tested different strategies for searching, maybe just move on to the church records, the parish records, and see if they're listed there. And deaths have a higher compliance prior to 1874 because burials required that the death certificate, burials required a death certificate because it confirmed to civil authorities, it confirmed that civil authorities were informed. Okay, so in that sense, you're much more likely to see a death before the Act of 1874. Okay, so the only way to obtain an official birth, marriage, or death certificate is through the General Register Office. And to order that, you'll need to create an account. And we're going to just go through the basics. I'm going to show you screenshots of how you would order the record. And so the first step, though, is you'll want to locate your ancestor in the GRO index. Now, the indexes can be found online, and then themselves are indexed. Indexes for births and deaths are searchable on the GRO's website. The birth index shows maiden name of mother. The death index shows age at death. And then searching, so I personally like to search for the births and deaths on the GRO's website because I can just click a button when I found the right person and it will immediately take me to the ordering part of the website. Rather than if I find the reference number on Ancestry or another website that has the index, and then I go to order the record from the GRO website, I have to go through a bunch of steps. And so I prefer to just search births and deaths here. Now, if you're ordering a marriage, you have to first locate the reference number before filling out the marriage request on the GRO website, and the GRO website itself does not have a marriage index. So let me back up. Births and deaths, you can search on the GRO website. Marriages, you need to find another way to search the index. And Ancestry, FamilySearch, there's any major genealogical research company is going to have this index there. Okay, so first step, locate them in the index. Second step, order the record. So here's what the GRO website looks like. And so you'll just register, and if it's your first time, you'll need to log in before you can access the index and before you can order a record. The GRO website birth and death index, this is what it looks like. So I have an arrow to where you can place an order. right underneath that, you can search the GRO online index. And so this is what it looks like. And it says one of the required options is you pick the year, and you can only go plus or minus 2 years. That's the drawback when you're doing research and you're not really sure of the death, because then you have to go every 2 years and change that, go 2 years and 2 years and 2, and it can get really tedious, especially if you're like, I think they were born in this 10-year range. That's when I go to Ancestry, another website that has different search functions that will allow me to do that a little faster. Okay, the GRO online index. So what it requires for you to put in is the year, the surname, and the sex of the individual. I put in the first name for Sarah Sharman, and as you can see to the right, this is what it populated for me. Now, something to keep in mind, civil registration, so kind of how it worked in simple terms is you would register the birth, and a copy would be made by the superintendent registrar's office and then be sent to the general register office every quarter. And so what you have here, and it's sometimes at first when you're looking at it, kind of looks like gibberish, but let's look at the first Sarah Sharman at the top. So she's born in 1854, March quarter in Huntingdon Superintendent Register's district, okay? And so, and then right after that it's telling you the exact reference number. So she's in volume 3B, page 211. Her mother's maiden name was Taylor. So that's kind of translating that for you. We decipher that, and so you can see each one shows you what quarter the copy was sent in. Okay, so that doesn't necessarily mean they were born in that quarter. This is just when it was registered. And after 1874, you're more likely to get it done within a certain time frame, so they're not fined, right? But just keep that in mind. This is not the exact birth date. You'll only get that from the record. So now we're looking, if you go down a little bit of ways, so the superintendent register's district of an area, that covered multiple parishes. And so Kettering's registration district is what covered my ancestor Sarah Sharman's parish, which was Rothwell, Northamptonshire. And so this is something you're going to want to Google. So if you know what parish, let's say that they were in, like for Lebbeus, St. Margaret's parish in Gloucester, go ahead and Google that and say, okay, what's the superintendent registrar's district? What's the registration district in simple terms of this parish? And that changes throughout the years. So you'll want to just keep that in mind. But it's a really good indicator of where you're going to look once you pull up this index on the GRO's website. So as you can see, there are 2 Sarah Ann Sharmans born in 1854 in the Kettering registration district. Now I know Sarah Ann Sharman's father is William, and the mother was Mary Norman. So because I know that information, I know which one to choose. So that's why it's really helpful. And a tip here, only the GRO's website will show you, at least in this time period that I'm looking at 1850s, the maiden name of the mother. So that's why it's really helpful to look on the GRO's website. All right, so let's say that you had a really large time range, like a big 10-year range, and you didn't want to go through the GRO's index, and so you had to go on Ancestry and start digging through their index of the index, right? And this is the process you would have to go through. You'd have to take that reference number that you found for the individual, and you'd have to plug it in as you start the application. So here's what it looks like. You click England or Wales. And right here, I'm demonstrating the marriage record. And then down there at the bottom, you'll say, I know the GRO index reference. You'll click that. And then on the left is what it looks like once you've done that. The marriage request. On the right is the birth request. And so you'll just fill out the information. You'll tell it whether you want a certified copy sent to you, which is the option for marriage. But if it's birth and death, you can request that they send you a PDF, which comes a lot faster. And it's cheaper as well. Okay, so like I said, you can't do the search the index of marriages on the GRO website. I prefer to go to Ancestry because I'm more familiar with that platform. But I'm going to show you a few different platforms, and they all pretty much tell you the same thing. So we're going back to Lebbeus, and I searched and searched for Lebbeus and had a really hard time finding him in the marriage index, even though I knew he was married to Selena. So what I did was I said, okay, I don't know Selena's last name. At that time, I didn't. So I said Selena, spouse, surname, Sharman, and I approximated when they were born based on when their child was born in the census. Okay, and that turned out this. And I said, oh, Sebens Sharman. Well, that's really close. And if you're familiar with the handwriting, you could see an S and an L getting confused. And so I said, okay, that's close enough for me. Let's order this record. And as you can see, let me back up and explain a little bit. So when there are 2 couples per page in the register's records, okay? And so if you know that your ancestor, say Selena Saywell's reference number is 7A, page 313, their spouse is going to be the same reference number because they're going to be on the same page. And there's another couple on that same page. And so what Ancestry and all the websites say is, okay, one of these 3 other people is probably the spouse. Well, one of them is the spouse of your ancestor, right? And so I look through down here and I say, okay, so given the time period, she didn't marry Mary Ellis. She might have married Sebens and might have married Thomas. And well, because I looked at the census records, which is why I recommend you do census first if you can. You've got enough information to track them, because that will help you when you're digging into these indexes. And so that's kind of the thought process there on how you can determine who the spouse might be even before you order the record. So this is what the actual index looks like. And so you can see it's Selena Saywell. The registration occurred in Gloucester. And then that's the reference number that you would use if you needed to take it back to the GRO website and order the record. Okay, and you can see here, so you've got Sebens, and it actually says Sebens. So I imagine when this was copied from the original register, that was done incorrectly. And then Gloucester, and then 7A, page 313. So this is what it looks like. And you can imagine before this index was indexed, how difficult it probably was to go through and say, okay, now I need to find somebody in Gloucester who has the exact same reference number. Can you imagine? It would have taken forever. Okay, FamilySearch is similar. You can see on the bottom it says possible spouse, possible spouse, possible spouse. Find my past. It says Sebens Sharman married one of these people. And then free BMD, so free birth, marriage, and death. This website is really great if you don't want to pay and you don't have a paying subscription to one of the other sites and you're not familiar with FamilySearch. You can also go here, and it divvies it up. If you look here, marriages that happen in the June quarter 1867, and so we've got Sebens here, Lebbeus, I should say. Okay, so let's look at what they look like. So this is the birth register for Sarah Ann Sharman. We've got our actual birth date. We have, what's really great about this is you've got her mother's maiden name. And keep in mind, though, that often it's the maiden name, but sometimes if the woman was married previously, it's her previous married name. So remember that and be careful when you're tracing back on that. He's a husbandman, and in census records, he's an agricultural laborer, so that makes sense. And this is the thought process, right? You go through, you look at the record, and you want to just make sure it's matching up with anything you've found previously, right? And Mary Sharman is the mother. She was the informant for it, and you can see when it was registered. So not too late after the birth on the 14th of October. Okay, now we have Lebbeus's, and that's a little bit earlier. It's born in 1845. You get, this one's neat because it gives you the exact street and area of Gloucester that he was born. And then you get his mother's maiden name. And when you're this far back, that is really helpful. If you can get somebody you have an ancestor that's born a little bit after civil registration and they actually registered, it's great. If you note further along on the record, signature, description, and residence of informant. So the informant was Harriet, but she gives her mark. So that indicates she was not literate. She couldn't write, she probably couldn't read. And then this was registered almost a little over a month later. Okay, so it took them some time but they did do it within a reasonable amount of time. But just note, it's possible they could have registered him in April, and then you would see him in a later quarter in the GRO index. And so remember that that quarter designation doesn't necessarily mean that's when he was born. Okay, so now we're moving on to the marriage. So here's the marriage of Lebbeus and Selina. You get full age, so they're 21, bachelor, widow. So that's something to keep in mind is, okay, if we want to research more on Selina, we might need to go find other marriage records for her. And then you can see her father was Samuel Saywell, Thomas Sharman, which we know from the 1841 and 1851 census. He's a framework knitter, so that's matching what we know. We're in Gloucester, so that matches. Lebbeus is a unique name, so I'm pretty sure we've got the right person. Married in the parish church by banns, and then you can see Lebbeus and Selina, they sign with their mark, so also they cannot read or they probably can't read and they can't write. And then the witnesses are important to keep in mind over to the bottom right. Michael Staples and Emma Saywell. So Emma is actually her mother. And we see, I discovered that on census records and tracking Selina a little bit more. And then Michael Staples, I haven't identified how he's related, but remember the witnesses are usually close family or relatives. Now I want to show you one. So the Sharman family has a long history of nonconformity. And what that means is many of them were not members of the Church of England. They were nonconformists. Thomas actually was Catholic, and I found his Catholic records in Bristol, and which is rare, to find something that he was born in 1801, and it was really cool. And his father's name was actually Lebbeus as well. So you can see how that is tracking down through the family. Now this is Sarah Ann Sharman's sister, Elizabeth Sharman, and she gets married in the New Jerusalem Church in Bradford. And so you can see she's not married by banns. She's not married in the parish church. She's married by certificate. So if you see something like this, and this is a reason why it's really important to order the registers, because it's going to tell you, and then the marriage register particularly, if they were nonconformists. You'll see that. Now, not always. Sometimes they still married in the parish church. But if you're lucky, you'll get the exact nonconformist church that they were a part of. And then you know, okay, I need to go find records for them. Their children might be baptized there. Maybe other relatives were part of that church as well. Okay, so if you can see more information, they're a bachelor, spinster, we get the exact age. And then William Sharman, as her father, was a laborer. Samuel and Elizabeth both signed their names, not with their marks. So by this time, we've got people in the family that are literate. Then we have Joseph, and then Catherine Sharman. And Catherine Sharman is actually Elizabeth and Sarah Ann Sharman's sister. Okay, now for the last bit, I'm going to show you death register. And this is a death register for Thomas. So my ancestor from 1841 and 1851. So he dies in 1868. And there are actually two Thomas Sharmans that were born, that died within a year of each other and were almost the exact same age. And so I want to show you what to do if you come to that and what clues to look for in death registers. You'll sometimes hear that death registers, when doing British research, aren't as helpful because they don't name the parents during this time period. And that's true. But there are other clues that you can find that can be really helpful. Particularly, if you look down here, you can see that Thomas was at the Union Workhouse in St. Margaret's Parish in Gloucester, okay? And that is a whole nother set of record groups. They typically sit at the county record office, so in Gloucester itself, but you will find some of them on FamilySearch's website in their catalog. And that can tell you an abundance of information about your ancestor, where they were born. Sometimes it names their parents, kind of the migrations that they might have come from, what other parish have they moved from, information like that. And so even though we don't get the name of his parents here, you can get clues to other record groups to jump to when you're looking at death registers. Okay, so he died in 1868. He's 67 years old, stocking framework knitter, that matches, died of congestion. a year later, 1869, there's Thomas Sharman, who's now 68, also at the Union Workhouse in St. Margaret, dies of old age. And they're so similar. And he's a wool comber, so it's not quite the same thing, but we're kind of in the same industry, right? And something to keep in mind. And so if I have yet to go to Gloucester and try to find these records, but when I do, that's something I'm going to want to look at to differentiate these two men. And then just some additional resources. So if you're kind of curious about the history of civil registration, want to know more about the compliance at a given time, this article found at the National Archives is really helpful. I enjoyed reading it, and I would recommend it. And then this is a book down here, Ancestral Trails, The Complete Guide to British Genealogy and Family History by Mark Herbert, is kind of like the Bible of British research if you're looking at England and Wales. And it's what we used in my own course when I was working on my specialization as well. Okay, any questions?
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah.
It looks like we have a couple questions in the chat box.
Oh, okay, let me open that. See if I can get to it.
I can just read them to you.
Okay,
Like.
yeah, that sounds good. That works.
All right, so the first one says, this is probably in reference to an earlier slide, but it says, what are those strikeout lines?
Great question. And you know what, I should have written it down. I always get them confused. They typically indicate the end of a household at a certain period, like this person at this. So I'll look it up. Send me the question in email, and I want to make sure I'm telling you the right thing, but I can't remember if it's one strike or two strikes. So send me an email and I'll look it up and give you the exact definition on that one.
Great. And Wilbur asks, any webinar on 1600 to 1840? Wilbur, I'm not sure on that, but you could probably check our website or YouTube and search it, and you might be able to find one.
Maybe I can do one at some point. It'll take some more research, but yeah, I could probably do one for you at a later date.
Awesome. And Jenny asks, did women who had an illegitimate child have to give the father's name? Sorry.
They were asked, and I can't remember the exact date, but there is a time when before they were asked and they would put the father's name, and then after they needed to get permission to add his name. And you can email me as well on that, so I remembered to let you know, but I'll get you the exact date on that. But yes, sometimes you'll see that. Another place to look is the parish church records as well.
Great. And someone else asks, can you please re-explain the distinction between marriage by banns and certificate?
Sure. So what happened in the parish church was basically they would go for 3 weeks. They would announce these people are getting married, and people in the community had 3 weeks to say, nope, he's already married to me, or for some other reason they shouldn't get married. And so that happened for 3 weeks, and you can actually see those records in the parish church records, and it will show the banns, and it will show you what week, each week that and it'll give you the date that the banns were not shouted, but given to the local parish community. And then certificate is they just went to the registrar's office and basically got a license.
Great. And Annette asks, did nonconformists include Jews? And if so, are there synagogue records available, particularly for the London area?
That's a great question. So yes, they did include Jews. And what's interesting is, and this might be too much detail, but so for my Catholic ancestors, and of course I'm blanking on the dates and I am not winning on that, but it's maybe 1787, they start keeping Catholic church records because the laws eased up. And really the only place that you could get legally married is the parish church unless you were Jewish or a Quaker. And so that's something to keep in mind. I am not as familiar with Jewish research. I can do some digging if you want to send me an email just to remind me, and I can kind of look into it for you a little and maybe ask some colleagues if they have any information, or sources that we could look into. But unfortunately, I'm not familiar with it. But if they're Jewish, they probably didn't get married in the parish church because they didn't have to for legal status.
Awesome. And I just add that we also have webinars on Jewish research as well. So you might want to look into that as well. And that can probably answer your question. Debbie asks, is this a good resource for Scottish research?
Are we talking about the book that I suggested?
Probably.
Yeah, it's okay. I have another one, and I want to give it to you right. So shoot me an email. That's going to be what I say for a lot, I'm assuming. But shoot me an email, and I'll send you the exact title of that book that I would suggest for you.
Awesome. And Shelly asks, my Aunt Erie is listed with an alias name. Under what situations would this occur?
That's a great question. There could be so many. I wish that I could give you some more advice on that, but it could be a range of things if she's trying. Yeah, I can look into it a little bit more, but it's hard to give you an exact reason why she might change her name. But people do that. I see it more when they're immigrating, obviously. They'll go with completely different names, but why she would have changed her name if she's been in England and stayed in England, I couldn't tell you. I'm so sorry.
No problem. All right. Judy asks, will a PDF be available? Judy, are you referencing her slides or a separate handout?
And to answer that, I probably won't create a separate handout, but we can definitely, I'll shoot a PDF over and we can have that available.
Perfect.
Of the slides.
Yeah, just you can just email it to me and I will include it when I post the video on the website.
Okay, great.
Annette asks, was there a 1921 census?
Yes, but it's not available yet. They have privacy concerns on that. So I believe it's 100 and, what am I thinking, 110 years? I'll double check that if you want to email me, but no, it's not available yet. But it will be soon. The 1921 will be.
Awesome. And it looks like that is all the questions so far. Okay, you got a lot of thank yous as well.
Okay, great. That's good to hear. I'm glad. And again, if you have any questions, shoot me an email and I'm happy to look into stuff for you as well.
Great. And we actually have one more question from Colby. It says, what date was the 1871 census taken?
That is a great question. The 1871 census was taken on the 2nd of April.
Perfect.
Okay.
Great. All right.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Rachel.
Of course.
And we'd just like to remind everyone about our webinar coming up next week on the October 7th, Going Further with Scottish Genealogy with Hannah Bell. And so if you're interested in Scottish genealogy, that might be able to help you answer your questions as well. So hope you all join us for that. Thanks again, Rachel, and have a good day, everyone.
Of course. Thank you. Bye.